Hello and welcome to my channel, Haylee Marie Vintage. Today is my shirtwaist September video. So shirtwaist September was started by Ashley Main Makes and Serena. I am doing my shirtwaist dress today. Definitely join us over on Instagram if you use hashtag shirtwaist September. I believe you're getting submitted into a pool of prizes, which is always very exciting. For the shirtwaist, we have a very special pattern from 1939. I'm gonna do the short sleeve version for sure on this one. In general, I'm not a huge long sleeve type of dress person. I like only kind of flowier long sleeve material. I'm pretty excited to make this dress. She's got some funky sleeves. That is the pattern, and here is the fabric. I wanted to do something pink. I feel like it's been a minute since I've done pink on my channel, and I like pink. This is, I believe, a Ruby Star fabric. I got it secondhand actually at Seattle Recreative, so I only paid $2 a yard for it. However, it is cut into two separate things. So I only have 4 yards cut in 2-yard increments, and it's directional. So I'm gonna have to be really, really intentional with my placement of my pattern pieces, and we're gonna see how it goes. But yeah, that is the plan for this. I'm super excited. I always really enjoy participating in these like big community things. It always helps me feel a little bit more connected to sewists. Since any of us who sew know that it is mostly a by yourself hobby. There's lots of ways to have community within the hobby, but it's mostly a by yourself hobby. So it's always really fun to just talk to people, see what they're doing, and I love scrolling hashtags like this. So I'm overall feeling pretty excited. Let's hop right into it. Alrighty, we are starting by cutting this out. The sleeve was not as weird as I thought. I don't know why I thought this was a weirder sleeve than it was. So the cutting for this was pretty straightforward. Biggest thing is I did add, like usual, that extra 1/2 inch to the sides. And then I am also shortening the skirt by quite a bit. I've talked about this in other videos, but I try to keep the circumference of the skirt the same, which means shortening things before I cut them, which means I am putting that shortening in now so that way I can keep the fullness of the skirt at the bottom. This will also help. Sometimes dresses from this decade are a little bit interesting in the way they sit around my hips, and this will also actually help with that because I made sure to shorten it where I would actually get a little bit of extra width around my hips. So those are all things that I've just learned over the years when it comes to cutting things. And then I will also note this was a directional print, so I did have to also really keep that in mind while cutting. There is a very much an up and down correct way on this fabric. And like usual, I'm going to remind you that I have both a Patreon and Ko-Fi. If you want to go over and either buy me a coffee or subscribe monthly, I give you access to videos about 5 days early on a Monday instead of a Friday. Sometimes a bit earlier than that if I'm getting my editing done. I don't make any money on this channel, so I always really appreciate anybody who contributes because this is a lot of work to run. The first step here is to work on the bodice. So I am putting in, essentially it's like a stay stitch, but it's a basting stitch for me to, I know I'm going to be top stitching this piece, and I've learned that it's a lot easier if you have something that you can clearly see. I'm also adding in my gathering stitches as well here. And the other thing that big thing of stay stitching allows for me is for me to know exactly where I am like folding that curve to and where I can actually clip to safely. This is something that it does take a little bit more time, but it is well worth it because I hate when you have a curved seam like this and you get those weird little corners because you didn't take the time to do this. I always do this now, even though it's definitely an extra step. And then here you can actually see me gathering and pinning and figuring out the bodice part here. I love this type of bodice on me. I think it looks great, but it definitely takes a little bit more work than either your typical princess seam or your typical darts. And honestly though, I don't super enjoy making darts, so I actually prefer this process even though it is longer. And because I'm top stitching, I am now taking all those pins that I pinned from the back and moving them to the front. This is again always kind of tedious, but it's the way I make this work, so. And then here I am finally putting in that top stitching. Very exciting stuff here. Actually it is. I feel like I've just gotten so much better at this type of project. When I was a bit earlier in my sewing journey, I definitely made a lot of mistakes and didn't take the time it really takes to do something like this well. And it's up to you when you want to do this. I'm pulling out the gathering stitches now because I don't want those basting stitches in. I'm also pulling out the basting stitches that go along the edges. I always choose to do this as I go because it really hurts my hands and I'm trying to preserve my hands in these projects, so I try to spread out these tasks, but this is definitely something that you could just do all at the end, no problem. And I am pinking the seams for this project. It is a really tight quilting cotton, so I'm not too worried about anything. And with that, I have the front bodice together, so here I am pinning together the back bodice. I am putting a zipper in the back because I prefer it to a side zip, even though it is in theory more unsightly. And then here I am attaching those shoulders. And we are constructing this in the way where I get to do the side seams last, so this dress is a lot more adjustable and easier to add or subtract basically sizes with. So I am now working on making the skirts up. These are, I believe, 6 gore skirts. But yeah, so I'm just sewing away. Spooky is being very cute and cleaning herself, and we're just enjoying our little soft sewing vibes this morning. And then here I am. I have started the practice of finger pressing before I go in with my iron to open up my seams so I don't get those weird, like, I don't know how to explain them. You know them if you sew. You get like the weird wrinkle because you didn't open the seam accurately, and so then the iron does something a little bit funky. So yeah, I've started to use finger pressing and I've been enjoying it. I feel like I've been just enjoying a slower process when I sew recently instead of kind of like the rush to beat the clock. And here there is gathering instead of darting on the bodice, so I am gathering everything on the bodice to fit the skirt. And the other reason I've been really enjoying the side seam last construction method recently is it allows you to put in the zipper when everything's still pretty flat. And the zipper is still, for me, one of the more tricky parts of the garment. So I really appreciate having an easier time putting in the zipper because now I've gotten good enough at sleeves that I can deal with all the extra weight and the moving around, but it is so nice to just put in a zipper when the garment is still so flat. And then with that all done, I needed it all prepped so I could put on the inner facing for the facing, but this is obviously a button up, so there is a facing and there's a whole system there. And I needed to get some of the skirt stuff figured out before I could start to figure out the neckline, which is strange, but again, I'm no longer sewing like in a traditional methodology. I'm sewing in a methodology that allows me to alter things in the future easier. So we're doing things a bit different here. I am also adding the interfacing to the collar. I am finding if you stack interfacing like this, it works still pretty well, so that's always great. And here I am finishing the edge on the facing. And then off camera, I sewed the facing to the collar, and I have now just started to trim all of my things with pinking shears because I find it almost works like little clips for all of those round edges and sharp things and stuff. So I trim pretty like close because these are not weight or like load bearing seams, so you don't need them to be as like fray resistant. And then I turn things out. This method has been working great for me. I found it probably on a TikTok somewhere, and definitely if you feel like you can never get things to press right, I highly recommend trying this out. But now I'm going to take my time like really working through these seams so that way I can press them flat because this is the collar and it needs to be pressed pretty well because you're going to see both the front and the back side of it because it's a collar. So yeah, just working with all of that. And then once I am happy with that, I am just pressing and ironing everything in place. A good press is really important. Here, this is kind of like a double collar. So I have first just ironed this bit and then you'll see what I mean in the next bit. This is the rest of the collar, which I'm ironing down right now. And it is unfortunately split in the back, which isn't ideal technically for these. But for me, it is important that I have that back zip. So this is the way it is. But I am attaching it and matching notches and marks and all of that good stuff. And then I'll sew that in. This is one of those weird ones. I feel like the 30s and 40s love this, where they have you sew each side of the collar kind of separately. One is a slip stitch, one is not. It's not my favorite way to do a collar. In fact, if I had really realized that's what I was doing, I would have cut these slightly different in the pieces, but that's okay. They love this in the 40s and early 50s, and I find that it can be most likely to result in a weird baggy collar, but today it ended up okay. And my last step for right now today is to put in the buttonholes, which is always a fairly straightforward process. All right, we are over here in Media on My Mind. I am doing a little bit of hand sewing. This project actually won't require much. So all I'm doing here is I'm going to hand sew down the part of the collar that needs hand sewing, as well as tacking that facing here. That is what I'll be doing today for Media on My Mind. Let me get my needle threaded and things started before I start talking. Media on My Mind. Let's see. I just finished The Coven Tendency, which is, I would say, a horror book. It's interesting because I would say like the vibes actually remind me a lot of Hanging Rock, or Picnic at Hanging Rock, I mean the movie, where it's kind of feels like a fever dream when you're reading it and is like kind of confusing and weird. But this one instead is very gory and horror filled as opposed to like the white kind of pretty pristine vibe. This one, yes, definitely horror, which I like go back and forth. Sometimes I love reading horror, sometimes I don't. I'm sometimes in the mood with it, and this time I was definitely in the mood for it. So I really enjoyed this book. It was interesting. I don't read good reader reviews until after I read a book. And I read the Goodreads reviews, and a lot of people found the book really confusing, which I can see. But I actually kind of liked how confusing the book was, because right now I'm fairly anxious, so having a book that I have to think a little bit more to follow has been a good thing. But yes, it's definitely like not the most straightforward book I've ever read. There's a lot of time jumps. And it's like, gosh, what was the book I was talking about recently that the point of narration kind of jumps around a bit without having clearly defined chapters according to it. Also, I will say this book was labeled sapphic, and it was sapphic, but it was like especially after having just finished Where Shadows Meet, which is very explicitly sapphic. This one left a little bit to be desired. Like there's sapphic crushes and things, but like I didn't feel like it was like sapphic, if that makes sense. And I was a little disappointed by that, but that's okay. This one, I'm just gonna say this is not a book for everybody. I enjoyed it, but I can definitely see why people didn't like it. So definitely, if you're thinking about reading it, read either reviews or definitely read trigger warnings. But yeah, I did enjoy it, and like it was the perfect thing for me to read right now when I'm feeling pretty stressed at work, because I was able to fully devote my brain to the book, because like I said, it's a little bit confusing and hard to follow, which I guess is not normally considered a great thing in a book. But it also kind of reminds me of like, Gideon the Ninth is definitely an easier book to follow, but it does kind of remind me of that. And it does have necromancy actually as well. So I've been a little slower on reading. I try to right now read about 100 pages a night, 100 ebook pages, but I've been dealing with more fatigue, so sometimes I don't read at night. Watching wise, I feel like I'm watching a lot of TV right now. Project Runway has started again. I definitely prefer some of the structure of the old school series, like definitely the new Project Runways. Everything feels very made for social media models. And I do kind of miss the like everydayness I felt like some of the old Project Runway stuff had, where it was like everyday clothes that had kind of like a cool twist, versus everything feels very like for the gram in current seasons. But that said, I'm still really enjoying it, and I'm glad it's back. I'm also watching Bachelor in Paradise, which I don't know. They redid the format. I think some things worked, I think some things didn't. And then what I have been riveted by is Perfect Match, which is a Netflix kind of like greater reality, like it's like the traders of reality dating shows with people like Bachelor, Love Island, and then of course all of Netflix's dating series on it. Structurally, I think it's the best out of all like this hot single like dating shows out there. I actually think it has the best format. Love Island's fun because it's every night, but as far as like the kind of like weekly ones go, I think this one by far has the best structure and showcases its cast the best, and I've been really enjoying that. I am a little slower on consuming media right now because I'm so busy at work. It's not a bad thing in my opinion. I actually think I consume way too much media overall, so I don't think it's a bad thing when I have to slow down a little bit. That's it for media on my mind today. I guess I'll probably film some of the other hand sewing that I'm doing, since I didn't do it on camera with you guys right now. Not that you can see anything I'm doing right now anyway. This is more of a chatty segment. I'm always taking recommendations. I feel like I haven't worked through any recommendations recently because I have such a backlog of recommendations, but I always enjoy your guys' recommendations. So I'm gonna get just straight to sewing. For dresses that don't have like a facing for me to sew my label on, I've actually been really enjoying sewing it into the zipper like this. I've definitely seen this in some of the 1950s garments that I own. I think it's a great way to put in your label in a way that won't show on the front, and if you do it correctly, it won't get tangled in the zipper either. I am also sewing on the buttons. I know all this work feels really early given I haven't even been able to try this on. However, the reason I'm doing this is because I need to know how the skirt, like basically the front closes in order to put on the skirt, because the buttoning down doesn't go all the way through the skirt. And I've found that if I sew the skirt to the top before I've made the buttons and the lapel work, I often get kind of one weird little bubble between the bottom button and the skirt because it's not exactly perfect, and this will hopefully allow me to have a little bit more perfection there and not have that weird little bubble. And this is exactly what I'm talking about here. I am basting that bottom part closed, and everything is perfectly flat because again, I've made my full lapel and everything like that. So I have now sewn up the front skirt, and the more I sew, the more I realize pressing is really important. So I do actually press the seams open, and then I turn it over and I do press them from the top as well, because every once in a while you just don't get it right from the bottom, and the top allows you to get it perfect. And then I'm adding in some additional gathering for the bodice here. Again, we didn't have darts, so we have gathers up at the top around that princess seam, and then we have them down at the bottom again. And I am finally attaching that front skirt here with everything gathered to fit. And then this is funny, the darts that we avoided in the bust, we are now doing in the arm. That is where this sleeve is a little different. Instead of doing a traditional gathered sleeve, which is what you would do, you're doing these 3 darts that give it kind of, it's definitely just a more geometric look as opposed to the kind of softer romantic gathers. I think it contrasts well with the gathers on the bust. This is not the first time I've done on a sleeve like this, but they're always really interesting because it's such a different thing, but I always think they look really crisp and sharp. So here I am of course just starting by marking and pinning these darts. And then after ironing these, you can really start to see again that kind of more geometric sleeve head here. And for the arm binding, I'm going to want a bias binding. I prefer to use a bias binding to finish my sleeves because the armpit is kind of like a high traffic, high wear area, and a bias binding just gives a lot more secureness there. And I've gotten to be friends with my bias tape maker. This doesn't take me very long anymore and is pretty low stakes. There's also going to be other places I'll want to use this binding. While the darts are here, I am still going to sew in a line of stitching because I still have to ease the sleeve in even with the darts. It's not like it magically fits into the sleeve head because this is still a relatively square shape and that is a relatively round shape. But once I have it eased in and sewn to my liking, I'm just going here with the bias tape, and then I'm just going around with that 1/2 inch bias tape that I made. Double fold. I love when it's made of the same fabric. I think it looks super nice. And again, the armpit is a high traffic area where for me, I want that extra security of a bias tape instead of the pinking. I wanted to try this on to make sure I liked the sleeve length because often the sleeves are a little bit too long because I have rather short arms, and it looks good. So now I have sewn on a bias binding, and then I'm real quick pinking again all the way around because I think this gives just a nice softer edge as well. This is a straighter edge, so you don't necessarily need the clipping of the bias, but I still find the pinking shears nice because when you look at clothes, you can sometimes see that really hard lined edge seam, but if you use the pinking shears, you can't see that line as clearly, which I like. And now I can also hem the skirt. I have put in my gathering stitches around the hemline as well as finishing stitches, and here I am just pressing, using lots of steam, taking my time to get this hem just right. And I'm also basically repeating that process minus the gathering on the sleeve hem here. And here I am wrapping up with the hand sewing of the hem, just a quick slip stitch all the way around. Super exciting. And with that, we are all ready for the reveal. I hope you enjoyed this Shirtwaist September with me. Alrighty folks, you have seen the reveal and I hope you enjoyed it. As always, we have cost breakdown. Ooh, I have hair stuck in my lip gloss. And we have project final thoughts. And then I have my Hope Helps segment, of course. First, going to cost breakdown. This is a pretty affordable project. I got the fabric at a local reuse center, so it was only $10. And then notions, I had interfacing thread, buttons, and a zip and a label, and all of that I got to $5.12. And then as far as the pattern, I spent $5 on this pattern, so great price, we love that, which meant in total, supply-wise, I spent $20.12 on this dress. This beats most fast fashion pricing. It's much higher quality, it fits better, all of that good stuff. And I love to mention that because sometimes I show really unaffordable versions of sewing here, but for the Shirtwaist September challenge, where hopefully I'll get a broader audience, I wanted to show you guys guys, it can be affordable to sew. However, I do want to call out the time it takes to sew because most of us sell our labor, which means time is money. Unfortunately, I would love for that to not be the case, but for most of us it is. For cutting, this took me 1 hour and 45 minutes. I've mentioned this, I feel like I've gotten a lot slower on cutting, and I think it's just I'm not rushing as much anymore. I'm trying to enjoy my process. Sewing, this is between like basically the ironing board and the sewing machine. I spent 6 hours and 30 minutes. And then hand sewing, super low on this, which is great, was only 45 minutes. So that brings us to a labor hour total of 9 hours. While for me, this is definitely a cheap item as far as supply costs, it is not a cheap item necessarily time-wise. To be fair, almost no sewing is. Sewing takes time, it takes energy, it takes a lot of things that our jobs take from us. So I do want to call that out because like I do think for a lot of reasons we need to think about the time taken to sew things as money. And one of the other reasons is across the world, a lot of women and children and just people who are marginalized and disadvantaged are taken advantage of and forced to sew for a living for either really, really, really low prices or it's entirely forced labor. And I think it's really important to address this always. We should all be paid for our labor, and the fact that in general our wages across the board everywhere are going down while profits are up impacts everyone. But I especially want to call out people who it really, really impacts, which are a lot of people exploited by Western fashion brands. And I don't think there is any reason for fashion to be exploitative because we're all so full of creativity and so many traditions and practices textile-wise across the globe. We can have really amazing fashion and clothing without exploiting people. But with that kind of in mind, I put my labor cost at a living wage, which is generally thought to be $35.39 here in Seattle. I think at this point the living wage has gone up because inflation's been wild, but I have yet to get those numbers back, so I'm still using this one. So I am multiplying that 9 hours of labor that I did times $35.39 to get $318.51, which means I would need to sell this garment at $338.63 to pay for my labor and for my supplies. Of course, a fashion brand would put a lot of profit on top of that. And yes, I do also want to mention I am not saying me sewing a garment at home is anywhere near one-to-one with a factory worker. I am not a professional, and I'm also not working under a lot of pressure. If you don't hit goal or don't hit whatever, you lose the little tiny bits of pay you get. So yes, it is not a one-to-one comparison. This would not take 9 hours to make in a factory. However, I still think it's important we think about the labor that goes into our clothing because all clothing is made by people. As of now, they don't have sewing robots. A sewing machine still needs a human to run it. So actually, technically they do have sewing robots, but they're few and far between because they're expensive and it's much cheaper to exploit people because capitalism. All about that profit. That is kind of everything about the cost breakdown here. This isn't crazy, I feel like pricing wise, if I was to sell it for this. It's definitely would be on the higher side of ethical brands, but a lot of ethical brands will sell shirtwaist dresses like between $200 and $300 depending on the fabric and the details and all of that good stuff. So I always consider sewing me saving money especially because I just consider my supply cost rate. I do this for fun. I don't do this for a living. So everything is just something to think about. But with that, I have the dress right here in all her glory. I actually for once took notes on my thoughts. I wore it throughout a day. It was really comfortable for the most part. The only thing that I noticed is I think the collar is just a tiny bit too stiff. This is a quilting cotton and sometimes it's a bit challenging to get the interfacing weight right for a quilting cotton. I should have gone one interfacing lighter than this one. It's just a smidge too stiff. Because like if you look at like this, which is another dress I made, the collar like kind of still, while it is stiffer, it has kind of that looseness or like the, I don't know, the sheerness. I don't quite know how to explain it, but like the hand still feels similar with the interfacing. It doesn't feel like a stark contrast versus the collar here. It feels a little bit more like a stark contrast in the way the fabric drapes. While you often use interfacing to kind of stiffen or like, honestly, not even necessarily stiffen, but like just make something stronger and crisper, there's like a range to it. And I definitely went a little bit too crisp. And I just wanted to mention that because that's something you don't know how to do as a beginner that you just kind of learn with time. And I just want to note that I'm pretty experienced and I still choose the wrong interfacing sometimes. And not all interfacing works with all fabrics. And that was something that took me a long time to work. I was using really stiff interfacing at the beginning of my sewing journey. The fit on this is really great. great. The arms are a little restrictive, which is not too bad, but the waist feels great. Everything else feels great. And the last thing that I noted is sometimes when it catches the light wrong and you're just kind of like looking, there's like little gold bits in this fabric. They can kind of look like a mustard or like ketchup stain in the corner of your eye. So I felt like I thought I had stains a few times when I definitely didn't. And that's just a fabric choice issue. I still really like this dress. There's nothing wrong with it. And I will say it was still really comfortable. I still really enjoy wearing it. I don't think anyone else thought I was covered in stains. I hope not, but I guess you technically never know. Yeah, it's comfortable. And I mean, if you've been on this channel a long time, you know I love a shirtwaist dress. I don't want to say like, actually no, I will say I think half of my favorite dresses are shirtwaist dresses. And some of it is I just love how you get to choose the buttons with the fabric. And it's just, there's like a little bit more room for creativity when you get to choose buttons on a garment. And especially when the buttons are so prominently featured like this. But yeah, that's my thoughts on this project. Again, shirtwaist dresses are for everybody. Now moving on to the Hope Help segment. I'm talking today about gerrymandering. I know, not probably something that you would think makes me feel very hopeful. She's been screaming at me as I've been recording this whole time, so I'm glad she made it. You made it in time for Hope Helps. But yeah, let's talk gerrymandering for a second. Gerrymandering has been super in the news recently between Texas, California, and then Utah as well, which Utah hasn't made the news quite the way California and Texas has, but it is in the conversation when we talk about things that make me hopeful. I was reading this really interesting article by Pew Research about how this kind of like in census cycle years redistricting is not super common, and it's actually a really big uptake this year that it's being talked about. And it sounds strange, but that gives me hope. And that gives me hope because what that means is the analysts and the people doing the work for the Republican Party are anticipating the Republican Party is going to lose big next election cycle, and that they absolutely cannot keep their control if they do not cheat. And I just think that has to give you hope, right? Because what that tells you is they can't win a majority. That tells you that the majority of people don't agree with their policies. Like it gives me hope for a lot of different reasons, right? If somebody has to cheat that much to win, they're not good, but it tells me someone is ringing the alarm inside the party and saying we are going to lose big if we do not gerrymander and push gerrymandering. So it actually gives me hope that they think they need to cheat even more than they do already. Already, Republicans are a lot of the people advocating for not having mail-in ballots and making it harder for people to vote via ID laws, and they also will close polling places strategically. Like they do tons of things to cheat. And don't get me wrong, Democrats definitely gerrymander, but I don't see Democrats asking for so many voting restriction laws compared to Republicans. So they're definitely the least bad party here. In general, I don't think a functioning or healthy democracy gerrymanders at all. I won't super get into my thoughts on that, but I do want to state that I don't think gerrymandering is the correct thing for a functioning democracy. However, I don't think we live in a functioning democracy right now. And the other thing giving me hope, aside from the fact that Republicans think they're going to lose big, is that there's just some really interesting redistricting talk. I don't like Governor Newsom for a lot of his policies in California. However, he does do some good things. I want to caveat that in this case, while I am praising him, I think there are plenty of reasons to also be critical of him and to continue to put pressure on him across the board. But he is doing something right here. I think the idea of Democrats passing redistricting laws based on if Republicans passed redistricting gerrymandering, I think that's really interesting, and I think it's really good, because if we are living in a world where Republicans cheat all the time and Democrats refuse to, Democrats are always going to lose. And again, I'm not going to get into how I also think Democrats need to get it together. I think it's good that we have Democrats starting to talk about playing dirty. And again, I think it's good. I also want to call out that Republicans are pushing forward gerrymandering, even though historically gerrymandering has been opposed bipartisanly among voters. Nobody likes a gerrymanderer until recently, which I am also going to link a poll about this from The Hill. Recently, it seems like more voters are in favor of gerrymandering on both sides of the aisle. I think it's in result to headlines, right? I would say I am heavily anti-gerrymandering. However, if Texas gerrymanders, I think Washington, who is completely Democrat run, should also gerrymander as a response to that. I think that then forces Republicans to keep themselves in check. It makes it so if they cheat, they know we'll cheat, and I think that's a good thing. I think just generally a lot of the tactics that Gavin Newsom is using are really positive in pushing kind of challenges to the Republican Party. I think it's good that I think more Democrats and more people who vote for Democrats are thinking more strategically along like beating people at their own game, especially the Republicans. I think that's really important because I think we're in the place we are for a lot of reasons, but I think one of it is that Republicans don't play inside the rules and Democrats try to be the good guy and play inside the rules even though it doesn't work. I think all of this makes me feel hopeful. And another thing that makes me feel hopeful that I want to note is actually a Republican judge struck down Utah's redistricting map, which I think is really positive because again, gerrymandering is not actually popular. The only reason it's rising in popularity is because of this whole news cycle, right? So yeah, I just wanted to call that out and hopefully you will feel a little helpful. I do also want to note it is September 2nd and this take could age like milk. So we will find out on that. I also think gerrymandering should always be talked about because it should be shut down. But yeah, that basically wraps up this segment. Hopefully you're feeling a little bit more hopeful, but while you feel a little bit more hopeful, also make sure to take action and be active in your communities in resisting just everything that's going on. And as always, thank you to Serena, Ashley Main Makes for running this challenge for the 2nd year in a row. I can't wait to join in on the 3rd year as well. And congrats to whatever winners that win for posting. Definitely be sure to join in and learn more about all the things by the hashtag #ShirtwaistSeptember. But with that, I am going to be back next week. I am here almost every Friday at 8 a.m. Pacific time, and I would love to see you there. And as always, if you're still here, subscribe and stick around. I'd love to have you. And then also comment down below and give me a like. It helps me out in the algorithm. And with that, I will see you next week. Bye!